Welcome. In this explainer, we're diving deep into some of history's most complex and, let's be honest, controversial figures, breaking it all down slide by slide.
So, today we're looking at one of the most unbelievable takeovers in all of human history. Just think about this. A civilization of millions, with a capital city bigger and grander than any city in Europe at the time, brought down by just 600 guys. How on earth does something like that happen?
Well, the answer isn't as simple as they had better guns. Not even close. What really happened was a perfect storm of political chaos, a devastating plague, and the relentless, borderline insane ambition of one single man. To this day, the man at the center of it all, Hernán Cortés, is seen in two completely different ways. Was he a heroic explorer who claimed a massive new territory for Spain? Or was he a genocidal monster who destroyed a magnificent civilization? So to really get to the bottom of this, we have to look at the man himself.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. And you might be surprised to learn that our story doesn't begin with some celebrated soldier of the Spanish crown, but with a rebellious, glory-hungry administrator from a pretty poor noble family.
Yeah, it's super important to get this straight right away. Cortés wasn't some general acting on official orders from the king. The conquistadors were basically venture capitalists with swords. They were private entrepreneurs funding their own high-risk, high-reward missions. Cortés was, for all intents and purposes, a rogue agent.
And this rebellious streak, it wasn't something he developed later in life. Oh no. According to his own biographer, he was a handful from the very beginning. This complete disregard for authority would, you'll see, become the defining feature of his entire life.
So he spends about 15 years working his way up the ladder in the Spanish colonies, eventually becoming a pretty wealthy official in Cuba. But that wasn't enough for him. So when the governor of Cuba gives him command of an expedition to Mexico and then changes his mind, Cortés just ignores him. He gathers his men and he sails anyway. This was straight up mutiny. From the second he set sail, he was an outlaw.
So when Cortés and his men finally land on the mainland, they don't find this one big, unified empire. Not at all. What they find is a power structure with deep, deep cracks in it. And Cortés was more than ready to take a hammer to them.
And his strategy here is just breathtakingly audacious. First, he sets up a new town, calls it Veracruz, and gets his own men to elect him as the legitimate commander. This was a brilliant, kind of shady legal move to bypass the governor of Cuba and report directly to the king. And then comes the most legendary move of all. He deliberately sinks his own ships. No retreat, no surrender. It was win or die. Now, you might be wondering, why would any of the local people join this random outsider? Well, this is maybe the most important piece of the whole puzzle. The Aztec Empire ruled its neighbors with an iron fist, demanding crippling taxes and, people for their human sacrifices. Cortés basically showed up and offered these oppressed groups a chance at revenge. This means the conquest wasn't just a Spanish invasion. It was also a massive internal rebellion, a civil war. And, none of this clever diplomacy, none of these alliances would have ever happened without one absolutely central figure, La Malinche. She was an enslaved woman given to Cortés who could speak multiple languages. She quickly became his interpreter, his cultural advisor, his strategist, and his mistress. Seriously, without her, Cortés is just a lost foreigner, completely blind to the politics of the world he just invaded.
All right, so let's follow him as he marches inland, right into the heart of the Aztec Empire, the incredible city of Tenochtitlán. This is where his unbelievable gamble really starts to escalate. Now, the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma II, he's got a problem, a big one. He was a deeply religious man, and there was this ancient prophecy about a pale-skinned, bearded god named Quetzalcoatl who was supposed to return from the east one day. And wouldn't you know it, Cortés and his men fit that description almost perfectly, leaving Moctezuma completely paralyzed with indecision. So Moctezuma lets the Spanish into his city, probably to try and figure them out. And what Cortés does next is just pure genius in the most ruthless way possible. Using an attack on some of his men as an excuse, he just marches into the emperor's palace and takes him hostage. Just like that, he had kidnapped the head of the empire and was now ruling through him like a puppet. But holding an empire hostage is a pretty fragile situation. Cortés has to leave the city to deal with another Spanish army that showed up to arrest him for mutiny. And while he's gone, his second in command,
totally loses his cool during a festival and orders his men to massacre a huge group of unarmed Aztec nobles. The city, understandably, explodes with rage. Cortés rushes back, but it's way too late. The Aztecs rise up and drive the Spanish out of the city in a bloody, chaotic retreat that gets called La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. It was an absolute disaster. They lost almost 900 soldiers and allies, and all the gold they'd stolen sank to the bottom of the canals as they ran for their lives. Now, for most people, this would be the end of the story. Humiliated, defeated, most of your men dead. But Cortés was not most people. He licked his wounds, regrouped with his allies, and prepared for the final and most brutal phase of his conquest.
So he comes back to lay siege to Tenochtitlan. But look at this. Just look at the size of his Spanish army now. This is no longer a tiny band of adventurers. This is a massive military force, and the vast, vast majority of it is made up of his indigenous allies, all dead set on destroying the Aztecs for good.
But honestly, his most powerful weapon wasn't a sword or a cannon. It was something he couldn't even see: smallpox. A disease brought over by the Europeans that the Aztecs had absolutely no immunity to. It tore through the city like a wildfire, wiping out an enormous portion of the population and completely crippling their ability to fight back. It was a biological apocalypse. So after this horrific, street-by-street siege that lasted for 3 months, the city, ravaged by disease and starvation, finally fell. The magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan was in ruins, and the Aztec Empire was simply no more. So what about the man himself, the guy who pulled all of this off against impossible odds? Surely he got the fame and glory he was after, right?
Well, if you look at his personal life, you see the same brutal pragmatism. His first wife, Catalina, mysteriously died right after she joined him in Mexico, and a lot of people pointed the finger right at Cortés. And La Malinche, the woman who made his entire conquest possible and the mother of his first son, was cast aside so he could marry a Spanish noblewoman to help secure his social standing.
And this quote right here, in a letter to the emperor, it just says it all about his mindset. The crazy part is, for all his unbelievable success, he never really got the power he felt he deserved. The Spanish crown didn't trust him. He spent the rest of his life bitter, in debt, and drowning in lawsuits, always feeling like he was never properly rewarded for his monumental and, let's not forget, mutinous achievement.
So that brings us right back to where we started. Hero? Villain? Psychopath? He was a brilliant leader and a master strategist. He was also a mutineer, a murderer, and a deeply ruthless conqueror. He was a man of profound contradictions who created a new nation on the ashes of an old one, leaving behind a complicated legacy that the world is still trying to make sense of, even 500 years later.